Allow me to start by detailing the nature of problematic stage design to give you some context. First, permanent on-stage walls could introduce multiple infinite combos, drastically reducing interactions throughout the game and over-centralizing the meta on one particular strategy, which I imagine wouldn't be fun for viewers and players alike. Permanent or often present walk-off areas lead to excessive stalling near blast zones. On-stage or floating solids, including overhead solid ceilings, could facilitate circle camping or extended platform camping with little to no counterplay, especially on those extremely large stages with numerous or separate platform layers. Hazards often can KO players directly, often removing the need for one to understand their character as much as how to abuse that stage element to accomplish the work for them. These are what I would designate as poor competitive stage design, as they tend to devalue individual skill in favor of easily abused and mundane strategies. Redundancy is a secondary issue due to how the stage banning process works, which means otherwise perfectly usable stages are excluded. Think Dreamland 64, Midgar, Wily Castle, and others. So what isn't problematic stage design that is often claimed as such? Semi-solid floors, non-linear layouts, and dynamic platforms. Arguments? Semi-solid floors affect ledge play and recovery, meaning players may bypass traditional ledge trapping and even shark or attack through the stage. However, sharking and recovering past the ledge both carry risk, since adequate preparation can allow one to reactively negate the threat and counterattack or even immediately destroy their stock, a la meteor smashes and other such things. One cannot refresh ledge invulnerability without landing, so repeatedly sharking and retreating to the ledge is a punishable offense. It generally plays out similar to standing on a platform while they jump up underneath you to attack, or not attack. Only they're more predictable in their available options, since there's no floor underneath them to easily keep up the pressure. In the terminology of the fighting game community, you're adding more Yomi layers to the ledge and recovery game. Now, this isn't saying every character can equally take advantage of recovering through the stage or counterattack sharking the same ways, but that applies generally when selecting a stage that specifically benefits your character somehow in the matchup. With a little creativity, surprising options could be revealed, and characters can end up more interesting thanks to just this bit of freedom. Might this be rewarding players in disadvantage? Well, if anything, it favors the brain over the brainless. Should I be rewarded for mindlessly spamming tilts, smashes, and aerials at the ledge to beat every option? That's only a conditioned reality we've come to expect, mainly from the popular characters, but not exclusive to them. So why not bring a little more to the game? If you compare what we already have, this new, actually not new stage archetype is the antithesis of fully walled stages, while in the center of these archetypes lie the skinny or bulky solid stages. Is it inherently worse to allow stages that disfavor wall hopping and stage spiking when we have plenty that do favor one or even both? This inequality doesn't seem sensible. Moving on, non-linear layouts can affect the neutral game, changing how effective certain moves are, like projectiles, grounded special moves, aerials, and others. Combos can be affected, and players may inadvertently find themselves able to survive beyond the norm from attacks with horizontal knockback launching one into a raised part of the stage. In a similar vein, dynamic platforms can affect combos and attacks, or even aid in survival, though some can keyword indirectly steal lives. Though impactful, all of these points represent a new level of depth a game could achieve, as they all can exemplify a player's level of skill, awareness, and knowledge of the game. Not one of these points directly cause degenerative gameplay, as do the problematic aspects pointed out earlier. These aspects have the effect of adding layers and improving options across the cast, even where they seem to take away. This is in part the essence of a counterpick stage, chosen to introduce new elements that may favor or disfavor a particular character or player, while still holding true to the competitive integrity of the game. Two other arguments are worth reviewing, the first I'll go into being blast zone sizes. Smaller blast zones allowing for earlier than normal knockouts are just that, they allow for faster knockouts. What it does psychologically is increase stress for the player worried about how much more punishing their mistakes may be. But if that alone were an issue, we would have to define a very specific blast zone range, if not just use one stage altogether. We all have to deal with stress on any stage, whether the zones are smaller or larger, so you'd have to bring a better argument against the outliers. If it's not as obviously deadly and degenerate as standing in the blast zone of a walk-off stage waiting to grab and throw them at 0% for the knockout, it's likely viable for competitive review. I understand the argument that we like to see interactions, but where do we draw the line at too little versus too much? Is it okay to die at 40% but not 20%? 100 but not 80? Is it bad if I live past 200% even though that means more interactions? This argument is a bit too flimsy at the moment for my liking. However, since I have an eye for numbers, I took it upon myself to analyze several details about the stages and have come up with an interesting hypothesis that may solve at least one issue. The default expected stage width appears to be 160 units, which is at a final destination in Battlefield, and even a newer stage like Yggdrasil's Altar. I never hear players complain about Smashville's width being just under 140, but I've heard plenty complain about Castle Siege and especially WarioWare, which are 131 and 116 respectively. I don't hear complaints about Town and City being too long unless compared to the total number of long stages we have. But interestingly, I've heard many complain about Pokemon Stadium 2's 187 units. Conversely, people tend to favor Pokemon Stadium 1's 176. And funny enough, Pokemon Stadium 2 and Castle Siege lie just outside the 15% standard deviation, which is 184 units upper end and 136 lower. I find it even funnier seeing that Yoshi's story is exactly the lower end and is generally favored by players who don't claim it redundant. So, does that mean that plus or minus 15% is the way to go, or is there something else worth considering? Well, another theory is to take into account the combined stage and platform widths, which doing so will allow you to see that a standard stage like Kalos Pokemon League goes all the way up to 194 units, which may explain in part why most people feel the stage is large. Town and City is in the same boat, going from 165 units up to 197, depending on the platform layout. And that almost reaches Mementos' 200 units, which is a stage not often legalized. Therefore, should we consider the deviation limit plus or minus 40 units when including the platforms? Or would most prefer it skewed plus 40 minus 20 just to keep out certain stages like Castle Siege? Perhaps we should define a blast zone range limit as well. From the center, the starter's blast zones widths range from plus or minus 230 to 250, 240 being the FD and Battlefield standard. Yoshi's Story and Yoshi's Island hit 227 and 220 respectively, which are the only often used outliers. Mementos hits 260. The stage to ceiling heights range between 180 and 192 units. So perhaps something in these numbers can help us quantify those feelings people have for these stages. It could be useful for future guidelines. If nothing else, it's food for thought. The other point to bring up is about the number of stages itself, which I believe gets closer to the true reason for this injustice. Put simply, we like simplicity. It's easier to get into something that's easy to understand and remember. Heck, the lack of simplicity in all of these unused stages is the true driving force of people's dislike for them. Rather than admit their inadequacy or blame themselves for their errors in judgment or inexperience, why not blame the stage for being too weird and different? I went through the ledge. What a bad stage. I died so quickly. This is jank. I can't ledge guard anymore. What the heck? My moves don't work because of these stupid slants. All are excuses that distract from one's failure to take something very simple into account before acting, and tend to be characteristic of one who's gotten too comfortable. Thinking about Tekken for a moment, even when their stage choice is randomized and the walls often change in orientation or even existence, the competitors understand that they need to learn how to combo properly with them no matter the position or wall type. It's one of the things that makes it unique. But hey, maybe you're of the mind that there's simply no need to introduce such dangerous elements into our game. Perhaps you're quite comfortable with it as it is. Perhaps you don't see the point in risking inconsistencies, as some will say, for some newer playing field. Perhaps all these stages suck for your main. Well, Bill Ekstrom once explained in a TED Talk how comfort is the bane of growth in life. Right above stagnation is order, but growth can only occur in a state of discomfort. We must seek discomfort not necessarily to the point of chaos, but to that of complexity. That is where entertainment lies, and where we feel alive and become better than ever before. If you are so reliant on the way things are to succeed, you cannot adapt and will therefore perish on the ever-changing battlefield of life. If I'm correctly reading your mind, you're probably thinking, hold up, what does all that philosophical jumbo have to do with the number of stages? Well, the key lies in our history, where evidently any stage found to diverge from the norm tends to automatically garner a majority of players' stage bans. This is important to note because it provides evidence that many players are, well, for lack of a better word, spoiled by stage bans. It's as if they feel entitled to as many stage bans as there are stages they dislike or would be at a perceived disadvantage on. It's as if they want only advantageous or at worst neutral stages. Oh wait, that sounds like other forms of competition. For instance, with football, the only environmental elements players would consider are the home field crowd and weather conditions. Martial arts competitions generally stick to a very plain arena. League of Legends pros need to consider different sides of the map with different pros and cons for particular objectives and characters, but it stays relatively even overall, perhaps comparable to the relative evenness of a chessboard, where statistics slightly favor white for getting the first move, even though black technically has control over the nature of the opening. Recent iterations of Mortal Kombat and the previously mentioned Tekken essentially have player-activated stage hazards, while Street Fighter and many others like it have no change whatsoever outside aesthetics. At this point, one might query, hold on, aren't you just countering your entire point? You could say yes and no to that. Following suit to the underlying wish of competitors, perhaps what we ought to do is reduce the stage list to a number so small and balanced that we won't need stage bans at all. Okay, problem solved. Oh, I forgot that it's impossible. Are you, as a competitor, willing to risk us defaulting every single stage to only Battlefield or Final Destination on random? Or perhaps maybe you think it's fine to just make every single game on Pokemon Stadium. Perhaps we should throw Smashville in the mix and have a 4-stage randomized list, or even force players to play on each of the 4 or 5 starter stages in a row to determine a set winner. Well, if that sounds like a direction you can get behind, then I hope you push for it. If not, well, hate to break it to you, but these are the closest we'll ever get to being like common competitive sports. Smash is far too unique, and we've already been stained with the knowledge of just how incredibly influential a single platform can be for the huge number of existing matchups. But, is that really a bad thing? Maybe, just maybe, that unique element pioneered through Smash Bros. Is a huge factor in why we stick with this game over all others, why its level of depth transcends what the characters could create without it, and why we often enjoy this game more than even the games its characters come from. I think it's very likely you who are listening right now had at one point declared Super Smash Bros. As one of, if not your absolute favorite game, period. As a competitor, if you feel you've lost some of that love since back when, I ask you, has competing dulled that feeling? Or perhaps is it from a sense of dwindling diversity? Are we going to accept such unjust and poorly thought out claims at stage viability just for the sake of a bit more security and simplicity? Are we really going to pretend a slant or moving platform is as bad as a bomb randomly dropping on your head? Are we going to act like recovering through the stages as hard to deal with as Brawl Meta Knight or Smash for Wii U Bayonetta at the ledge? Are we going to look at 15 stages and immediately think we suddenly need 4, 5, or 6 bans? If we're going to be playing a platforming fighting game, we ought to allow all those aspects that can flourish in its competitive environment without actually hurting it. And here's a tip. If you want to try and legalize new stages for the purpose of testing, fairness, and allowing new styles to flourish, you must legalize more than they could ban out. Conversely, I'm saying to disallow or limit what one can ban. Assuming we only had 2.5 semi-solid stages to pick from, it wouldn't make sense to allow others to instantly ban all of them. Redundancy in similar platform archetypes is not comparable to similarities in floor archetypes. If we wanted to allow any more bans, we'd have to limit them. Perhaps specific to starter or counterpick stages, something like 1 or 2 per category. Or maybe introducing a third stage bucket and segmenting bans per bucket for the purposes of Game 5 sets, while simply merging them together as counterpicks for best of 3 sets. I could even see a good rule set restricting starter stages to Game 1, disallowing them completely in the counterpick phase, with variances in best of 5 sets. I don't want to get too in depth with this topic and complicate things, but there are many ways to improve our current system for sure. Getting back on topic, it's already become apparent that people's fears control them to automatically ban outliers. Therefore, you'd have to have so many of them that they're no longer considered outliers. You can't just tack on Castle Siege and expect to gain meaningful information about the stage itself, because people will treat it like the ugly stepchild or the weird kid at the park. You have to let the weird kid bring his friends along so the kickball game will be equal parts weird on both sides. And maybe you'll learn a couple of those kids were pretty alright, if not just a bit awkward to approach and get used to. They might even become your best friend and greatest ally. So please, don't be afraid to talk to someone new. Don't be afraid to give out chances and risk being uncomfortable. And don't be afraid of Lilac for crying out loud.